All right, I will start the stream now. And we're going live in 3, 2, 1. All right, I welcome the audience to the stream. And without further ado, if everybody is ready, I welcome the first speaker of the affirmative side. Here.
Yep. Yeah, it should be all right.
Yep. Yeah. It is quite far. Like it'd be easier if we just whatever. Doesn't matter.
Okay. Can you hear me? Perfect.
Yep.
Okay. All good. As a musician, you are deceived into signing a contract because you seek artistic expression and you seek financial validation for your talents, not recognizing that record labels actually break the sanctity of those two aspirations. They are slave drivers, they are money machines we oppose. What we actually support on Affirmative is artists rising independently on platforms such as SoundCloud, such as DistroKid. And we have 3 clear paths to victory. Firstly, we could prove that labels clearly exploit artists at their detriment. Secondly, that artists can survive commercially when they are independent. And thirdly, that the quality of music is significantly improved when they are independent. And I'll be talking through the first point on why there are inherent manipulative qualities of these record labels. Secondly, why the industry is better when artists are independent. And then Hunter's going to split on why we get better creativity of music produced on our side of the house. So firstly, what are these inherent manipulative qualities of record labels? We have 5. Firstly, the whole reason why record labels are manipulative is because they generally target young, vulnerable artists who want to fulfill this dream, and so they're attracting them with these very large sum deals immediately. Payouts. And the reason why people take these deals is twofold. Firstly, that if you are a discovered artist, that means that you've had limited exposure to the industry. You're likely to have a huge information barrier and you're not going to understand the full extent of that deal. Secondly, if you are a low income artist and you need an immediate source of income, you are likely to play into these deals. And so, for example, if you're an artist, like a hip hop artist from Compton, and Def Jam offers you like the 6-figure deal, you're going to take it because you need that immediate money. And what this means is that it is incredibly harmful on the artist, since most contracts for new artists don't have masters, and that means that you can't earn royalties, you can't even own your own music. So that means you're worse off financially and you're worse off creatively once that deal ends. And so Neg may push on this then, that, oh, well, an artist can just sign another deal once their deal ends, they're still going to get money some way. And we would say that like most artists peak and fall off after 5 years, 10 years in the music industry. There are a few immortalized, like Taylor Swift, for example, but if you compare her to Little Mix, who reached equal popularity to her in the early 2010s, they're quite irrelevant now from the mainstream, and that clearly shows in like how their record labels then choose to sign contracts or not. Secondly, the manipulative qualities of record labels are exacerbated when we're talking about minors, when we're talking about children, because they're particularly preyed on by this industry. This looks like the fact that Britney Spears' dad, as her guardian, held rights to her music, meaning that she had no income from any of the records that she produced. And the record label itself was the enabler of this very parasitic relationship of those harms onto Britney Spears. Thirdly, record labels are highly materialistic, and they have certain expectations of an artist's aesthetic and control that artist's aesthetic. This looks like in K-pop, you might hear this sort of adage that your weight cannot start with a 5, meaning that we have these 20-something-year-olds being forced by their labels, by their managers, to go on these highly restrictive diets, to be under 50 kilograms, or to, for example, to have rhinoplasties, to have eyelid surgeries, to fit the aesthetic of their label, to fit the aesthetic of their brands. This is mentally so harmful because your whole identity and your whole self-worth is highly damaged. And also there are like quite physical outcomes of this because you might faint on stage from being so malnourished. We also tell you that in hip hop, for example, you might be encouraged to buy chains, to portray a very lavish lifestyle, to fulfill this persona that an audience of typically white teenage boys plays into. Thirdly, like overall what this means is that you're perpetuating these very harmful societal expectations and stereotypes because record labels want audiences to correlate African American men with like a thug life, which is so harmful for everybody else that is part of that demographic. Fourthly, record labels are incredibly manipulative in how they overwork the artists because they have control over your hours. This looks like how in K-pop, like SM Entertainment makes their trainees and groups perfect dancers until like 2 a.m. in the morning, and that's going to have those same physical effects that I've just talked about. And then fifthly, and Hunter's going to talk more about this, but record labels can also prohibit you from releasing your own music, and so he's going to talk in depth on why that is so harmful. I'll take a POI if you have one.
Yep. Yeah. What opportunities does your side provide for small artists to grow their brand?
So I'm literally just about to go into that, but we say that, okay, so why is the industry better for small artists when they are independent? Like, why do they get essentially the same benefits even more on our side of the house? Because Neg may push us, which I assume you're doing, about exposure and how record labels have networks, have connections that we lose on our side of the house. And we have 4 reasons why this doesn't happen and why it's actually better on our side. So firstly, our current culture where we are infatuated with social media influencers who are largely self-made makes exposure pretty symmetric, potentially even better on our side of the house because our society also values the narrative of the underdog and someone like who fulfills a specific niche that doesn't happen with industry plants, that doesn't happen with mainstream artists who are backed by this huge corporate label. This looks like how Lil Nas X bought his beat for $30. He produced everything. He promoted himself on TikTok and got a Grammy all on his own without a record label backing him. That shows that people can be highly successful, highly self-made, essentially coming from nowhere. And again, a lot of his popularity was coming from how he represented this minority group as being both Black and gay and making it in country music. So that shows that clearly, like people can be equally influential, people can be equally exposed even when they're working independently. Secondly, we tell you that connections are better on our side of the house because they are formed organically through autonomous choice on who you want to work with, like with someone who has a common artistic purpose as you. On their side of the house, what they're really supporting is the fact that we have K-pop groups formed by the metrics of who will sell the best albums due to their like visuals and vocals and how well they dance, or they have people like Drake who just get assigned to random collaborations with random artists who get paid who pay his label $500 to work with him. That's going to inherently produce less authentic music, which we don't support. Thirdly, we tell you that good artists are equally likely to have these opportunities, even when they are independent of these big labels backing them, because of 2 things. Firstly, that social media, like I've just talked about, means that we're super interconnected, that it's really easy to establish your own brand if you are valued by the rest of society, if you are valued for artistic talents, which we assume these artists have. Secondly, that labels now generally swoop in on artists who've already established, like also swoop in on artists who've already established themselves because they also don't want to take a lot of risk for a lot of the people they sign. So that means that theoretically these artists could continue succeeding on their own and they don't need this big label backing them. We also tell you that they may gain the short-term payment that I've talked about, but I've also discussed the harms that are associated with that. But secondly, that we actually get these long-term benefits of creative and financial freedom rather than having these record labels take, for example, 80% of your royalties and like owning your stuff for life. On our side of the house, we give the artists autonomy over their work. We give them the autonomy in expressing themselves and in being experimental. We stand for the artists so proud to propose.
We thank the first speaker of the affirmative side for that wonderful speech. And now we welcome the first speaker of the negating side. Hear, hear.
I'll just take my POIs verbally, but I will probably ask for one. Record labels are the path to success and fame for most people. This is the goal they accomplish, and this is the purpose that we need them for. Record labels are necessary for artists to get out into the world. Today, we will prove that our side of the house provides the best outcomes for artists and their listeners. In our counter model, we propose that we should regulate the ability of labels to hold rights over their artists. These labels still get a portion of the money made, but they cannot exclusively hold rights to music. This creates a dynamic in which the artist holds all the power, but the label gets money from it. And this is their incentive to support these artists anyway. First, some rebuttal, then my 2 points of substantive. Affirmative will likely tell you that labels create toxic spaces for artists and the like. 3 points on this. Firstly, this is not true of all labels, and it is only true in a few cases which we see promoted heavily because they are outliers and interesting cases. What doesn't get promoted is the success stories that come from labels. So we associate negative connotations with them. Secondly, in response to the toxic allegations that labels are, labels can work to become safer and better spaces. They don't want negative media attention, so we're already solving that problem on our side of the house. Thirdly, on our side of the house, the artist does have control and power as to where the music goes via their fan base. In terms of labels exploiting artists, we tell you that they will be motivated to stop doing this on our side of the house because the fans will hold them accountable. Like, take Taylor Swift, for example. She mobilized her fans against the record, and her record label has not succeeded since. I bet you can't name it. So labels will be held accountable. So we already have a mechanism in our world of how labels are held accountable for their missteps. The affirmative speaker also talks about smaller artists can establish a brand on things such as social media. Social media is an uncontrollable factor. You would have to rely on being an outlier and a small chance of going viral. This is not a stable position for an artist to put themselves in. 2 points of substantive. Firstly, how on our side of the house, we create better outcomes for artists, and secondly, how we create better outcomes for listeners and music itself. So firstly, why does our side provide better outcomes for artists? What we tell you is that artists may get less of a portion of the money when they're with a label, but the profit they are getting is so much bigger than what they would get without that label because of what the label is able to do. I challenge you to name a super rich and famous artist who doesn't have a label behind them. And if you can, it's 1 in 100. There are not many. These artists need labels to support them. How do we see this happening? 3 points. Firstly, labels are able to provide promotion. They're able to pay for tours, get better quality of music because they can provide studios, they can provide bands. For artists who aren't great with lyrics, they can provide songwriters. Secondly, labels are able to provide a community of artists that they can work with. If you are on Sony Records, you can easily connect with another Sony record artists because they can set you up. They also create festivals where fans are encouraged to listen to a more variety of music. Thirdly, what about artists who don't have a label? Labels have an incentive to take on these artists because they want to profit. They need to look for new and exciting artists, so they're going to try find like indie artists who are popular on streaming platforms and try and sign them. This is a good thing because it provides people with fame, fans, and money. We saw this work with the SoundCloud artists, rappers, who got signed by a label and are now super famous and successful. On the comparative, what does this look like in their world? Without record labels, we see it become a game of the survival of the fittest. People who already have money will get to fame and success way faster than those who don't. Even people born into musical families will achieve this outcome quicker because of their connections. This takes away from the music and becomes more about connections and wealth. It doesn't really rely on talent to become successful. On our side of the house, labels are able to provide a whole new audience to people who are talented in all aspects, not even just their voice, maybe their music playing or their writing ability. We see on our side of the house that the label wants more money, so they will do what they can to get your voice as an artist heard and help you become successful. They will go for talented artists because that is what gets them money. Here is the result for indie artists. On their side of the house, If you're an indie artist, you can't rely on performing in pubs or performing in pubs or putting your music on SoundCloud as a job. You cannot support yourself. Likely you stop making music because you have another job, which actually supports you in your life. So you lose your love for music because it becomes difficult for you to do. You may be able to entertain the people in your community, but the only people getting paid for this and becoming successful are those with enough money to get themselves there to start with. On our side of the house, labels are able to be the path to publicizing your music. We guarantee better outcomes for both small and big artists. I will now take a POI.
In the 1960s, Phil Spector controlled the entire soul industry in the United States. Why should a white guy have complete creative control over the output of all African American music for a decade?
If you were referring to a label with a white guy in charge signing a African American band, is that correct? Okay, they get that choice. They don't have to sign with that label in the first place. It is their choice to sign with those people. And again, they're not exercising, we've specified that these labels are not taking the rights away from these people. They are just getting them out in the world. So if that artist is uncomfortable with the situation that they're in, they don't have to get into it in the first place. My second point of substantive, labels are better for listeners and provide a better quality of music. So how do we see this happening? A few reasons. Firstly, smaller records can provide you with more artists from the same genre which you as a fan prefer. This means that people have more good artists that they can listen to. Also, as a fan, you are more likely to go and find new artists if they are on the same label as someone you already like. So listeners are able to expand within the genre of music they enjoy and find more artists they love. With the promotion of a second mechanism, with the promotion of diversity of big labels, fans also see ads from other artists from other genres. So you will get exposed to other artists because a big label can afford to publicize this more. This is really important for diversity and can expand a person's music taste, allowing them to access all types of music. Labels make music much cheaper and more accessible. Because they put so much money into concerts, they become cheaper. If you're an individual putting on a concert, you cannot afford to spend lots on it. It will become more expensive and therefore a recreation for the rich. Labels are able to pour money into streaming services, which make those cheaper as well. This is significantly important because it means music becomes about enjoyment and appreciating the art form rather than a business transaction. On their side of the house, it is likely fans will stay listening to the same artists without being exposed to others and a diversity of music. People will listen to the same artists and experience less diversity because only large artists have the ability to promote their music. People get their music taste from these ads and what they hear on the radio. If you're a non-pop artist who cannot afford this, you will not be heard. Beethoven was able to survive before, but with not having a label because at that time music was not an industry. For our day and age, we need labels. We see benefits such as an increase in accessibility, more artists being promoted, coming out into the world, diversity. We see artists who don't come from connected or wealthy backgrounds giving a shot at fame and success, and this is why I'm proud to oppose.
Yeah.
We thank the first speaker from the negating side for that wonderful speech. And now we welcome the second speaker from the affirmative side. Hear, hear.
SideNeg struggles in this debate when they don't actually understand the record label industry is an oligopolistic market. It is a market controlled by companies like Sony and Disney that hold 70 to 80% of the market share. All of the benefits side negating wants to claim about these individual record labels offering better deals simply don't exist when there are only 2 or 3 highly coercive options that coerce you as a young, vulnerable artist stand with side affirming the side of the artist in this debate. What am I going to do in my speech here today? Firstly, address whether record labels are manipulative. Secondly, can artists survive? And do they do better without labels? And then thirdly, I'm going to split on the creativity of music. Let's firstly walk you through, are record labels manipulative? We firstly told you that record labels are likely to be manipulative because they offer a significant amount of money for bad deals. What was side negating's response to this? They essentially tried to fiat in that they're going to change the model of how record labels work and have like further regulation, which means that they can't like take your masters, but they can still like do other things. Look, we think that this is kind of at tension with what they then told us later, that these record labels want to like make a lot of money. So it means that even if side negating claims and is able to claim that record labels under their side are now going to act better and maybe not take your masters, you're probably going to get worse deals overall where they take like a higher cut of your Spotify income or something like that, or your royalties. Or maybe they're not going to promote you as much because like they're not actually getting that much of a capital investment from you. Secondly, then we told you how these record labels are particularly bad for minors or like people who don't have legal representation and might not understand the contracts they're signing. No response from this, from side negating. Thirdly, then we told you about how these record labels are highly materialistic and they can force aesthetics onto you like losing weight or being like a gangster in hip hop. What was side negating's response to this? They essentially told us that these negative connotations are just exaggerated on like our side, which we completely think is the wrong response that side negating has told us. We tell you that what you actually see is that like in somewhere like South Korea, there are only 3 labels that control all of the K-pop. In hip hop, there's only a couple of labels which control all the output of hip hop music. So it means that like these connotations are highly ingrained into how this music works. You can't just say, oh, just because Sony did it, that's just like one example, considering that there are like only a few like record labels in general. We fourthly then told you about how these artists are likely to be overworked. We didn't hear a response from this from side negating. And then fifthly, we told you about how these like record labels can prohibit you or like have significant restrictions on your level of control. Side negating tried to flip this and say that you actually get more control through some sort of mechanism of fans, but we tell you that you don't actually get much control when you're under a record label, primarily because of the reason which side negating agrees is they want you they want you to make money and they want you to maintain some level of an image. We can see this in examples of people like Adele who don't actually have control over their social media and their Instagram accounts, and that these record labels maintain the control of their image. It's far worse, especially for these up and coming or small artists who have even less bargaining power that side negating wants to stand behind, because they lose even more control as record labels take more risk and these people have less bargaining power with these record labels. Record labels are manipulative. We have proven that point. Secondly, then to move on about can artists survive without labels? What did we tell you? We told you firstly, that things like social media and exposure allow for artists to develop. It also leads to the unique outcome of things like organic growth, how people love a good underdog story. That's something that side negating doesn't get. What did they tell us? They told us that you have to be an outlier to like do well on social media. That is completely symmetrical on either side due to the mechanism that the record labels are generally like overwhelmingly going to go after people who are already well developed, and they're going to do it even more on the side negating side if they want to put in their counter model about more control on record labels. Because if there's now like more risk going into these record labels, they're now going to like only go after well-developed artists. So it's symmetrical about people being outliers. I think we already knew that people in the music industry are outliers. But then secondly, we tell you that you get better control of social media as an artist because your social media accounts aren't getting taken up by like those record labels. So those record labels aren't forcing you to be entirely materialistic. You have control over the narrative and your artistry. We think that's really important. Secondly, then about connections, we told you that like we can still form things like connections. They try to tell you that you get access to things like producers, like musicians. Look, we think that's completely symmetrical on either side. With social media, it's very easy to reach out to artists, to producers, to find like particular people. And secondly, we actually think if side negating wants to win on material about new artists, it's actually better on our side through social media, because now your record label Sony isn't saying you have to do a song with Drake or Kanye. They're saying you can do it with that random producer who's just coming up out of you. Like when you're independent, you can do it with that random producer that doesn't have that many streams, but you like their music, instead of being forced by Sony or like your record label and dictating what exactly, like who exactly you can collaborate with. Thirdly, then we told you about how we're still able to get like opportunities because of these like people swoop in for developed artists. Side negating tried to use the idea of like SoundCloud rappers and like how this is actually a good thing about record labels. We actually tell you that's a very bad and counterintuitive example side negating given to you, primarily because of the fact that most SoundCloud rappers were forced into like highly materialistic things. They got involved in like fulfilling those sort of stereotypes, people like Lil Pump or like Bobby Shmurda, for example, trying to fulfill those stereotypes about like how Black men are supposed to be presented in the media, and they don't have control over their masters, and they don't get a lot of their royalties. It goes to companies like Def Jam, for example. So that's not the right example that side negating is actually used in this debate. But fourthly, then we told you that payment is actually better on our side for 3 reasons. One, because we don't have forced royalties or masters like being taken away from you. Secondly, you don't get cuts in your Spotify or like streaming payments, because like what we see in the status quo under record labels is like, 80 to 85% of it goes to like a streaming platform, like it goes to your record label. It's better on our side. And thirdly, you don't get like a forced culture. We heard no response from this on side negating. I'll take a point now if you have one. Yeah, I'll take it.
How can you guarantee that services such as social media will provide people with a fan base big enough to make them a profit to live on?
Well, we tell you that if social media is not providing for them for an artist, why is a record label going to sign someone who's so unpopular and like isn't even liked on social media? We think that we've already told you that record labels are going to sign established people, which means that like if you're not getting traction on social media, record labels are going to sign you. Okay, let's talk about creativity of music then. Why is creativity of music worse on side? Firstly, we tell you that record labels like generic stuff, but they tell you, firstly, they do it because like they have like a brand image, or like they want to go for things like radio play. And then secondly, like you have things like old white men controlling the narrative and what they think is like socially acceptable. We also tell you that secondly, record labels can seek to delay content. We saw this with like Kanye West trying to roll out his album and record labels blocking them because they don't want artists on those particular albums. It makes it harder for artists to put out music because record labels can block what gets released. And thirdly, we tell you that record labels can force things like collaboration, which can be inherently uncreative for artists and what their particular purpose is. Why do we improve this then? Firstly, we get no dilution of creative talent, which side negating gets when they have artists sort of like being forced to conform to the mainstream norm, especially with record labels having such wide control over what's in vogue. They're able to control what artists put out. Secondly, we tell you that labels force artists to commercialize. Many do not want to do this. Better on the other side, when you're an independent artist, you can have control of your own narrative rather than being forced to be a commercial puppet. Because we're the side of the artist, we're so proud to stand on side of filming.
We thank the second speaker of the affirmative side for that brilliant speech. And now we welcome the second speaker of the negating side for their response. Hear, hear.
Sorry, guys, I'm just going to get my timer sorted. All right, I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. When you see Taylor's version at the end of a song, you see a record label being held accountable for abuses of power, right? And an artist flourishing despite it. We think that artists still get the same benefits that AF offers on our side of the house without suffering the harms of underfunding and the loss of publicity that they naturally get without a label to promote them. So proud to affirm. First of all, I'm just going to talk about the model that they've provided and why it doesn't work and it won't help to promote artists. But then I'm going to go through and talk about the key point in today's debate, which is how we actually benefit artists, but also around the quality of listening, which is a point that was brought through by Isabella and not really properly responded to by the opposing team because they ran out of time. All right. So let's have a look on Model. What they tell us is that like the way that people are going to succeed on their side of the house is through SoundCloud. First of all, we tell you that this is just not exclusive, right? It can function as an opt-out on our side, right? If people don't want to work with the label, they're happy to work through SoundCloud. We're happy to support that. But here's why they don't in the real world, right? On SoundCloud, on Spotify, you have thousands and thousands of different artists competing, which means that special ones with talent don't actually, they don't stick out, they don't get, I'll take a point later. And so they're not able to get tours, right? They're not able to get things like tours, like merchandise, which is where most of an artist's revenue comes from in the streaming age. All of this means that even if AF is able to shoot down the main benefits of having a record label there, they have nothing to fall back on. There is no mechanism on their side of the house for how artists can become successful and maintain themselves. So we think that falls out of the debate at that point, but let's have a look at the main point of clash in this debate, which is about the benefits to artists, right? Struggles between artists and their labels are big news in a world where labels dominate the media landscape. What we don't see on BuzzFeed and Vice, however, is actually like the tremendous benefits that these labels offer these artists. And the fact that like you wouldn't have actually heard of Taylor Swift without the help of people like Scooter Braun, even though in the end he turned out to be like an abusive piece of crap, right? So, okay, let's focus on the points that were brought by the second speaker first, right? He tells you that like music and the record labels there are an oligopoly. First of all, we tell you this is just like not true, right? There are like niche labels that persevere in each area, right? You've got things like Dreamville, like previously Def Jam and like now Dirty Hit in the UK, right? There are labels there that actually are able to offer niche audiences for specific genres. But secondly, like competition between the big labels is still really valuable for generating outcomes, right? If you say, I'm actually just going to go to Disney instead of Sony, then that's actually a benefit for you, right? But thirdly on that labels actually can develop, right? It isn't like a supermarket chain where there's a huge startup cost and you can't break that duopoly. You can develop a label with relative ease if you have talent and the artist to do so. And so we think that's a huge benefit when we get to that level of competition on our side of the house. They tell us that the key point that we hear is that labels are abusive because they like force people into like expectations of how they should exist. We tell you that is even worse on their side of the house, right? These expectations exist for a reason and labels have to push them for a reason because that's the only way people are going to succeed in that genre. Because like in K-pop, in Korean society, there is an expectation that your skin is lighter and that you are skinnier, and that like actually these artists are going to be forced to fall into these categories even more so on their side of the house when they don't have a label to protect them from that kind of shaming and from that kind of like abuse, right? So we think that actually labels are a protection against these kind of expectations, and we see that as being a huge benefit on our side of the house, right? Okay, what else did they tell you, right? Like that you can push people, that labels actually push people to create records, and that's like a hugely abusive thing. We tell you that actually like it isn't the worst outcome that someone should have to meet a deadline, right? Every other career has to do it. Why are artists so different in this, and why shouldn't, like they're not put under any more crunch than say like a coal miner is, right? But like in this case where this like verges on the extremes, like it's either A, criminal offense where they're actually committing workplace abuses, or B, it is held accountable by the fans, which is a mechanism that was brought to you really strongly by Isabella. All right, they tell us that like small artists don't have the ability to rally their fans. We tell you that like smaller artist fans are like actually super important because they're like the only source of income for that contract. And so like if you actually want to get like income off a smaller artist, you have to rely on their fans, and so their fans have a huge amount of sway over it. Thus, the artist has a huge amount of sway. So smaller artists still have that mechanism. Not quite yet. But yeah, okay. Let's talk about. So much to respond to. Let's talk about money, okay? We tell you that comparatively, we get more money in the pockets of artists. Why? Okay, first of all, we get tours, we get merchandise, and we get royalties from like widespread play and movies and stuff like that. These are things that a label can uniquely guarantee you because of the reach that they have and the people that they hire to do so. On SoundCloud and on Spotify, under their side of the house, you only get money from streams. This is not the way that an artist can actually succeed in the streaming era, right? This is not enough to support them, and so we can't support that. But like, yeah, we'll move on from that. Secondly, like the label can actually promote these songs really heavily, which means that even if they do take something like 50% of your revenues from streams, you are still getting more money because you're getting like 200% more streams. So the money that you get is still being doubled. Not sure if the math checks out there, but you know what I'm talking about. All right, so they bring up like Lil Nas X, right, and how like he was like he came out as gay and stuff, and he was able to like succeed in these things because he was on TikTok. We tell you that Lil Nas X is a perfect example of this because he was able to transform from a one-hit wonder on TikTok into a continuing star who has defined the generation. Because after that one hit, he was signed to a record which could help him flourish, which could help him succeed, which could get him a collaboration with Billy Ray Cyrus. That's a huge Like, that's a huge success for him. And the fact that he came out as gay, like, he actually couldn't come out as gay until he had the label to protect him, right? He was masquerading as a straight man while he was on TikTok because he wasn't able to actually succeed in that area. So we get better outcomes for artists on our side of the house. We get like the artists who are like, we get artists who have a control over their work and who have control over their views. That's a super important outcome. Yeah, I'll take your point.
Most of the benefits you've talked about are with concerts and tours only go to the very top % of artists. For the vast majority of artists who get signed and then get dropped immediately, why do you think they're actually likely to benefit from like a record label instead of just being manipulated and sort of all their money taken from them?
First of all, we don't think that's true, right? We live in a world where like small artists can have tours and do have tours all the time, right? Potentially they're not able to do a world tour like Taylor Swift is. That's not a huge harm, right? The reality is that they're still getting benefits from their labels and they're still getting either the promotion on YouTube or TikTok. They're still getting a huge amount of benefit from their labels just because they're a smaller artist, right? Okay, final point and then we'll wrap up. They tell us like what side get, this is a point that Isabella pushed really hard that we didn't actually hear any response to from them properly, which is that we improve quality of listening to music. And the only thing they really tell us on this is that nepotism still exists on our side. We tell you that, like, unlike their side, like labels have a very strong incentive to find the next big thing. Because of this, like people who aren't nepotism babies do get a platform. Sure, we're willing to concede that on our side of the house, you do get like Willow and Jaden Smith sometimes. But on their side, you only get Willow and Jaden Smith because they're the only people who actually have the platform to promote themselves. And they're the only people who aren't viral hits who can actually get out there and produce their music. We get a greater diversity of artists, a greater diversity of listeners, and that's massive. All right, so let's look at even in AF's best case scenario, what do they get, right? Where we differ from AF in their best case scenario is that we see that music can be both entertainment and art, right? On their side of the house, a decrease in public appeal and in listenership, music returns to what it was pre-record labels in the 19th century, right? It is a form of art exclusively for the rich. It is not accessible. It is not diverse. Labels have done for music what studios have done for the movies. They have made it accessible, they have made it diverse, and they have made it so much a better place to be for those who are involved in producing it. Proud to negate.
Am I audible? Good. Okay, cool. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. What the NEG fails to contend with here is that the music industry is still fundamentally exploitative of new artists, and for the artists who are large enough and their fan base is powerful enough that they will not be exploited, those people do not need the labels. A few points to clash. First point of clash, why the music labels are inherently bad for small artists and why independence is the best alternative. And in this, I will argue why established artists are forced into joining a label and why ultimately this is bad for them and their art. So on the first point of clash, how new artists are exploited. We've told you right from first that these are vulnerable people. Maybe this is their first artistic output. They want money. Perhaps they're from poor backgrounds. They lack the means to really succeed. So what happens? The vast majority of these people fail. Not many people actually succeed coming through this environment. So what happens? When they sign, there's like one lump sum that's handed out, but then all their musical output for quite a long period of time is owned by the label. The label can exploit them for that. This is especially bad in cases in which underage people are signed and their parents are enabled through that system to control their output, as happened with Spears. Now, this is really, really important because new artists are the biggest group here who are impacted. Nobody cares if Kanye West makes even more money. That is not what we're arguing about here. We're arguing about the artists writ large. And if we can prove that these new artists are exploited, and if the alternative, them being independent, is the better alternative, we win this debate. So how have they answered this challenge? So first of all, they've said that fans stop exploitation. It's a tension in their case when they argue that fans stop exploitation by a label, but you need a label to get fans. What we're saying is that a lot of the exploitation happens when you first sign, when you sign away those rights before the label hands you fans, even if it does hand you fans, which we do not concede. So even in their best world, in which these labels are really helpful, they still have power over you insofar as they make that fan base for you. They arguably have some form of control over it as well. They have influence. You do not have bargaining power, essentially. Bargaining power is also extremely important because it is an oligopoly. Sure, there are a few niche labels, but Sony Music is still the largest player. It still signs all the important people. Sony Music dominates this industry. There are some smaller ones. Sony will buy them soon, I'm sure. The important thing here is that you have no bargaining power as a new artist because you're not going to run along and say, I'm a new artist. I haven't made any output. I've got one album or one song. Sign me. Sony is handing me a bad deal. They will laugh you out of the boardroom. You know, you have no right, you have no standing to go ask for a superior deal from a label if you're not established. That is why these new artists are basically screwed over by these labels. And when they fail, these labels are not there for them. And if anything, if they own the masters, then they cannot even make money from their failed career in music down the line. These people are the most harmed people in this debate. The other angle here has been that they just stop the exploitation or they ban contracts where you signed away rights. First of all, you cannot reframe what we're arguing about. We're arguing about opposing labels. Therefore, we can only really be arguing about them in their current form. You cannot say we would change them like this. No, you have no fiat power to change the way that the music industry works on neg. What you must do is you must stand behind the status quo in comparison to our world. You have no power to invent your own fantasy land in which harms are prevented. On to the second point of clash, independent artists and why independence is the superior option. For new artists, for indie artists, there is a valuing online of like being original, being authentic. It's even a branding thing, you know. People will attract followings. People will succeed in these areas. It's also important that a label will not sponsor an indie artist unless they've done all that work themselves before. So fundamentally, if they acknowledge that a label will take on an indie artist, they also must acknowledge that there's a potential for that indie artist to have built themselves up earlier. So then what we're actually arguing about is why that indie artist joins a label, why that change is made, and what that says about if we should oppose the labels or not. A few points here. One, new artists, as I said before, have information failure. Thus, even if they choose to go on the label, maybe they really want money, maybe they don't fully understand the terms of their contract. Their lawyer won't be as good, their advice won't be as good, they're exploited in this way. But for artists who are more fully actualized, I guess, there are pressures inside of the industry. For instance, a fear of industry power. If a label also owns the firm that runs a venue, that is a very tangible incentive that label may feel obligated to sign up. That is something that we must oppose. Importantly, even if the comparative is they don't have a show, we should oppose people being exploited by labels, regardless of what the alternatives are. It is a bad in and of itself. Another sense in which these labels may have coercive power over you is if you have already signed and they own a large amount of your content. As you advance, there's a trend that your previous stuff becomes more more widespread amongst your fans as your profile increases. Thus, at this point, you're kind of stuck because you have this anchor with them because they own your early stuff. There's no choice really. All their material about how people make this choice falls out of this debate. And finally, the actual output that the label will incentivize is much, much worse. That Phil Spector example is very, very valid because I don't think that if those soul groups had the opportunity to authentically show themselves, I don't think that they would make the same 4-minute song 800 times over and make that soul for 10 years. It's very important that these labels make it essential that artists commercialize their output, that artists try and appeal into the widest audience, and these incentives do not exist because there is a fear that the label can prevent them attaining any success at all. Therefore, they're pushed towards the most commercial form of success, where they make the most money for that label, where they're the most harmed, where they're the most exploited, and where the actual quality of their output falls the most. So proud to affirm.
All right, can you guys hear me? Sweet, I'll be starting in just a few seconds, just setting up my timer. Okay, so what do we see on their side of the house? Well, we see small artists not able to promote themselves. They have no funding, no platforms, no way to promote themselves and get bigger in the field. What we see is that a few select artists with massive amounts of money, with family history, background, or just a few outliers who will be succeeding in the industry, and it will not create a diverse environment that supports everybody. On our side of the house, we support labels because they provide a platform for every artist. So what does our world look like, right? They've tried to tell us that our world just looks like a monopoly and that it's really manipulative. What they haven't done is engaged with our counter model. We've told you what it really would look like was labels being held accountable. They haven't responded to this enough. We've told you that this accountability leads to a less manipulative environment within the industry. Their world, on the contrary, looks like people being unable to even start up their business. They don't even have the opportunity to grow their brand. They don't have the platforms needed. They've told us a few points which I'm about to rebut now. So moving into my first point of clash, which is the smaller one about the industry, right? They've tried to tell us that it's controlled by just a few labels. What we tell you is that bigger labels can only sign so many people, right? And when they're held more accountable, and when these labels are doing manipulative things, people will leave and go to these smaller labels. This builds up the industry. This actually creates a better industry for everyone included in it, right? What we see is that with the increased awareness of this label mistreatment, it is less likely that people will be manipulative in the first place, and they will be less likely to manipulate people into signing, right? So this kind of minimalizes the harm that they've tried to sell us throughout all of their debates, right? They haven't engaged with it enough. What we will see is people signing with these smaller labels because they stand for similar things, they fit those niche genres of music, and this is what we see, and that is what we want artists to explore because it allows them to grow their brand and connect with people with similar, interests and similar genres, right? The second thing they told us is that labels won't sign people when they don't get this sort of social media thing, when they don't have this already set fan base, right? They've completely misunderstood where labels scout from. Labels scout for talent that has not yet been established because then they can make the most profit. This is a good thing for everyone because it builds up these smaller artists, which is simply not possible. This is a benefit that is exclusive to our side of the house. No, thank you. The second thing that they have told us here is that we should not support labels simply because of their monopoly, regardless of the result, right? This is something they just brought up, that no matter what, we should not support labels. This goes against their own case, right? This means that they have somewhat accepted, that there are, that labels actually do help them, but that we should go against them regardless, right? But what we see here is we actually just see no one able to get a foot into the industry. We see no one able to climb up that ladder. We see no people from possibly younger people or people from poorer communities able to actually enter the industry. And this is such a terrible thing for everyone and for the listeners, which is something that they have not rebutted. No. Moving into my second point of clash about the artists, right? So first of all, they have tried to tell us again and again that these artists, that these records and these labels are manipulative. What they've not engaged with is that on outside of the house, their motivations change, right? They're not motivated to manipulate people. They are motivated simply by the profit, which is actually a good thing because it forces them to actually support these people. It protects them. This is just a good thing for everyone because they won't have an incentive to manipulate because they have accountability. So this kind of goes towards my second point a little bit about how they talk about how young artists are being targeted and this sort of thing, right? What they told us is that they have limited knowledge of the industry and they don't know what's going on, right? Surely this means that without a label to guide them, they are not able to survive in this industry, right? Using their own logic, a person who does not understand the industry cannot survive in it. Without these labels, they will have no way to enter the industry. They won't know what to do. They won't know how to build up their thing. They won't know how to get ads. They won't know any of this. And so they simply won't peak. They won't get anything without a platform for the success, right? They brought up the example of Britney Spears here, which honestly, a whole different issue. That wasn't by the label. And honestly, those sort of things just fall out of the debate, okay? Moving into the second point here about how artists are forced into quite toxic places, right? They talk about how they have to meet certain standards, 30 bottom types, this sort of thing, right? Will has already addressed this a wee bit, so I'm just going to recap on what he said about how they actually provide protection, but also they are held more accountable here because we see the industry changing, right? This is, again, something that they have not engaged with. Because the industry is changing, because these labels have less power, they become more accountable. They can be held accountable by fans, artists, and the law because people will be less afraid to speak out against them, right? Because their contracts aren't tied to their rights. They can actually leave these labels and hold them accountable, which reduces the incentive for labels to do this, okay? Moving into the second big point here about connection. So I've got a few points under this. Firstly, they talked about how everyone loves an underdog story, right? They used Little Nas X, which Will has already covered. But also, most niche artists and genres won't be promoted, right? They won't be on radios, they won't be on ads, they won't be anywhere because they have no one to actually fund them to do this. This means that even if there is an odd outlier, like Little Nas X, right? It's not going to be the majority of people. They are not able to benefit the majority of small artists who actually have this talent, right? They also talked about how, you're still able to do this with like SoundCloud, Spotify, this sort of thing, right? That's not an exclusive benefit. If someone's signed to a label, they still have control over social media because these labels no longer have control over their rights, okay? That's not an exclusive benefit. They cannot claim that, which means that they cannot win this point. Okay, the next thing we talk about is how they claim that connections are formed organically, right? We tell you how, okay? If a large person has social media, has a large social media platform, right? They probably have a manager for it. They have people who will go through, because they will get hundreds of messages every day from people just wanting to support them, right? Just direct messages. So there is no way for smaller artists to contact them without just being immediately denied by these managers. Whereas on our side of the house, when we see like communities within labels, the labels can actually set them up, get them connected. And the bigger artists, right, will actually see these people and they will see them as more legit because they actually have backing behind them that labels can say, yes, actually, we support these people. They are talented. You should collaborate with them, okay? This cannot happen on their side with just media, okay? The next thing that I'll talk about there is just a little bit about like, if they're not being formed through here, where can they be formed through, right? They've tried to tell someone outside it's just forced. We do not see this, okay? When you have communities, there's nothing forced there. People can turn it down, but they get recommended people who are within their communities, within their genres, who are talented people. These artists, these labels, will be providing people that they could collaborate with, right? The labels will say, this person is great. They have this sort of style. They can do this for you. They're a great writer. They'd fit in with your song really well. Okay, and that is a really good thing for everyone. This benefits the label because they can sign more people. People have an incentive to sign. This benefits smaller artists because they have a bigger platform where they can connect with people who are larger than them, which they cannot do through simply social media. All right, and thirdly, it benefits artists who are already established because it allows them to diversify, to look at new people, and to still be relevant because they could be collaborating with these people who are just up and coming. Okay, this is a great benefit that they cannot claim on their side of the house because there is no way for smaller artists to have a platform to actually connect with these people, all right? And that is a huge part of our debate, right? We're talking about what is best for the artists, what is best for the artists, right? And that is all that really matters, okay? They cannot claim any of their benefits if their artists have no platform to run on, okay? So they cannot win this debate if they have no outcomes. Therefore, we win this debate because we provide the best outcomes for everyone within the music industry, including the artists. Thank you.
Yo, yo. All right. Can everyone hear me? We good? All right, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Look, first off, we win this debate from the get-go because AF actually cannot provide an alternative model that works, right? Even if they were able to prove that labels are manipulative, which throughout this entire debate they are not able to prove, there is no mechanism in the debate where artists can succeed and maintain a fan base, right? There is no standing mechanism left in this debate because we've told you that the SoundCloud doesn't work, we've told you that the Spotify doesn't work, where artists can actually succeed. But nevertheless, let's have a look at where we actually clash with AF and see who comes out on top in this debate. Right, first of all, on artists, right? What did Isabel tell you, right? She said that like labels can provide tours, merchandising in studios, and these are incredibly beneficial because they A, provide artists with more revenues, but B, provide them with just like significantly more exposure, right? We tell you that like, this went like largely unmitigated in the debate, right? Secondly, like they can provide like new artists with the platform, right? Artists who haven't been recognized before can get that kind of promotion so that they can succeed and get more fans, right? What did they tell you? They told us that actually this is bad for artists because A, they're pushed for deadlines, which we've shown like is probably a reasonable thing to expect in an industry, but B, that they're like pushed for image standards, which we've shown is going to happen on both sides of the house and is like entirely symmetrical because of the way that society functions, right? Why is our argument more effective, right? Well, we tell you that our artists already have mechanisms in place for protecting their intellectual property. We say that labels actually help them with their well-being by giving them money, protection, and success, and therefore we come out with a better outcome for artists. Now that's most of the debate, but I'd like to touch on something that Isabella brought up first, and that was very rarely responded to throughout the entire opposition case, right? The quality of experience that we get for the fans. Look, AF didn't really have any response to this. We could tell that there was going to be something touched on in second speech, but unfortunately they ran out of time, which means that it still stands in the debate, right? Here's why this is important, right? Even if AF can get a slight reduction in the harms done to artists, which is like the best that they can actually hope for on their side of the house, Isabella's material still stands. If music becomes more accessible for people, becomes more interesting, and becomes more diverse, we think that we've actually guaranteed a huge benefit that is worth any kind of like minuscule harms that the AF might be able to provide. So we think we win on that point, right? So we win on artists because we give them better outcomes. We win on quality of like experience just because we generally get a better experience for the artists. Both of those are better experience for fans. Both of those are debate-winning material. Let's have a look at kind of like a final characterization of what the world looks like after all is said and done in this debate, right? Based on what stands in the debate, here's how we can see a realistic world, right? With less entertaining and popular music being produced, which we've shown is going to happen, right? There is like fans retreating from music as a medium. We tell you that like revenues are going to dry out for artists. They're likely, as Isabella and Stella both told you, to go and pursue a career which is more rewarding for them, and they're like unable to like make it in music unless we have like virtuosos who exclusively cater to the rich. What does this mean? It means a regression in music from being an entertainment industry into being an art that is enjoyed exclusively by the rich and exclusively by those who have the privilege to address it. That's not something that we're able to support at all on our side of the house. We think that we've won this debate fair and square, but we thank you for the awesome quality debate. Thanks all. Thanks so much. Cheers.
Side neg cannot simply fiat in that the record industry is going to become more accountable, is going to change the entire culture of which it has been built upon, and that this is all going to be held in the accountability of fans. They cannot fiat this all into the status quo. Stand with side affirming, the side that is grounded in the real music industry. I'm going to walk you through, firstly, what record labels look like and why we went on this characterization, even if you buy side negating's counter model that they brought. And then secondly, why artists are able to both perform at the same level and thrive without labels. Let's talk about what these record labels look like then in our characterization. Both teams agree firstly that these are largely profit driven. This is symmetrical. Secondly, we tell you that these record labels drive materialistic and societal stereotypes. Side neg says that these still exist, but we tell you that this is still worse on their side because when you have such a large presence of record labels as a media industry, they're able to continually perpetuate these. We don't get these when it's like grassroots artists that are able to perpetuate their own things rather than the interest of the label. Thirdly, then we told you about controlling the narrative. The only mechanism that side negating said about why record labels are unlikely to do this is that fans are going to be this mechanism which stops like record labels from being abusive, from being manipulative. Firstly, if fans are such an amazing mechanism which can unhinge multi-billion-dollar industries, we tell you that why do artists even need to sign on record labels in side negating's world when the fans can just provide them with all the money, all the support, and everything they need? Side negating can't change what record labels look like through their own mechanism and then say, oh, but you know, we still need the labels anyway, even though this amazing mechanism of fans can just change the whole industry in itself. Fourthly, then on the idea of market structure, they tell us like these, they give us some examples and bash us on them about small labels. We tell you the vast majority are still owned by a couple of record labels. You don't actually get that much option for deals. All of the examples they want to bring to us about like artists that have some level of bargaining power only exist for the very top. The very few are manipulated and easily like taken advantage of. So we win on that characterization in the real world. But if we want to play inside negating's world, we still win because even if you buy their material that you're not going to get abusive things like you still have your intellectual property rights, because these firms take more risk, they're likely to sign you on worse deals. You're not likely to go and find these new and upcoming artists because it carries more risk. You're going to go with someone more established, which means all of their material falls out. And all of the harms that I've just brought to you still exist. Because we win on this characterization, it means that we can prove all the harms I'm going to go in next. Okay, how do artists act then without record labels? We brought you on first very clearly that social media is a mechanism for how record labels, for how artists can function. And side negating did agree with this in the start, talking about things like SoundCloud and how this allowed artists to blow up. So if they believe that social media can have some like level of power, they then can't then push the narrative that music is going to become more centralized without the idea of record labels. We told you how the barriers of entry into music are much lower without record labels. They are much lower at the moment and even more on our side with things like easily getting onto DistroKid for about $40, getting onto Spotify, getting onto SoundCloud. The barriers to entry are much lower. You can still get exposure. We also brought you the mechanism about how you get more money in the long run because your masters aren't getting signed away, because you don't lose so much money to like royalties and stuff like that. We heard no response for this. If side negating wants to fight on things like money, we tell you we still win on money because we prove that these artists get better financial outcomes in the long run rather than they do 5 years on their record label, their money runs dry and they get dropped when they're no longer popular. Thirdly, then they told you that people can like just leave bad labels, which is completely ridiculous thing they brought on third neg. We tell you that you just can't leave a label because it's a contract. And then finally, the material about creativity. We heard no response to my split material about creativity. We tell you creativity is much better when you're not being controlled by a record label that tells you what gets radio play, what you need to put out, and what fills images, like fills titles, stereotypes. Creativity is much better on our side when you have control of your narrative due to the reasons that I've shown you about why record labels are manipulative. Because we're the side grounded in the real world. We are the side of the artist, stand with side affirming.
We thank all speakers for this wonderful debate. And now I welcome you to normally